This morning, I want to talk about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread and its relationship to the Lord's Supper. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." That's found in Matthew 26:26. Thus, Jesus instituted the observance of the Lord's Supper that Passover night. We can be sure that the bread that Jesus took up that night was unleavened, for the Passover night led into the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, memorializing Israel's deliverance from Egypt. We learn of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread from Exodus 12. The observance began with a complex purging of leaven or yeast from every household. And the Israelites were there then not to eat any leaven for 7 days. And that's found in verses 15 through 20. The event is described in Exodus 12:39. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. God initiates the memorial and provides the reason for the observance in Exodus 13:3. Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten." The Feast of the Unleavened Bread memorialized Israel's flight from Egypt and their deliverance from bondage. The bread was to be unleavened since the Israelites had needed to depart quickly with no time to waste for the bread to rise. Israel was a people on the move. Thus it came to pass that when Jesus broke the bread on the night of his betrayal, the bread he and his disciples ate was not leavened. While some may believe that the lack of leavened bread is merely incidental to the story, the imagery of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread and the supplement current use of the image of unleavened bread in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 5 through 8, indicates that it's significant that the bread was without leaven. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread was a memorial brought both of a great act of God in delivering Israel from the bondage in Egypt and the beginning of Israel's journey to the Promised Land. The Israelites were quickly thrust from their home and everything they had known to begin their long and perilous journey in a harsh desert. Christians find themselves in a remarkably similar situation. The Lord's Supper is a memorial of the great act of God delivering us all from the bondage of sin. We put on Christ, we are quickly thrust out of our homes, the familiar world of sin and death, and begin our long, perilous journey in the midst of a wicked world. Likewise, as the Feast of the Unleavened Bread memorialized the beginning of Israel's journey to the Promised Land, so we are in the midst of sojourning on the earth, awaiting our promised home of rest. The Apostle Paul finds great value in the imagery of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, especially in the purging of the house of all leaven, as it is written. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul applies the idea of the Passover and the subsequent feast of the unleavened bread to Christians in sin. In Galatians 5, verse 9, Paul likens sin to leaven, both in the terms of immoral practice and false teachings. Just as a little bit of yeast is able to spread throughout the whole lump of dough, so even just a little bit of sin can spread throughout the entire church. Paul has no desire for this to occur. As the Israelites were to purge their houses of leaven in order to celebrate the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, so Christians must purge sin out of their lives and out of the church in order to be found pure and faithful to God. Jesus did not institute the Lord's Supper during the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread by chance. Just as God delivered the Israelites from bondage and set them on a path towards the Promised Land, he has now delivered us from the bondage of sin through Jesus' death, setting us on a path towards the promised rest. Just as Israel was to purge leaven from their houses, so Christians must be diligent to purge sin from their lives. We ourselves must be unleavened and pure. Christ has been sacrificed for our sins. Who have been made holy can now observe our own feast of the unleavened bread in the Lord's Supper.